Number 1. Luke Timms Woodham was 16 years old when he became the central figure in the Pearl, Mississippi school shooting. He was an 11th grade student at Pearl High School and worked part-time at a local Domino's Pizza. To many adults, he seemed quiet, bookish, and smart. But court records later described a childhood that felt unstable and isolating. His parents fought and divorced when he was in the 6th grade, and he told the court he was often left without steady adult supervision. He described his relationship with his mother as cold and distant, and he said he had struggled with depression since he was a young child. In the months leading up to the attack, the pressure points in Woodham's life tightened. He had a history of being teased for his appearance and felt humiliated by it. He dated a classmate, Christina Menifee, and when the relationship ended, he described the breakup as emotionally devastating. Jealousy and rejection became part of his story about the world. Investigators also examined his connection to a small circle of peers tied in public reporting to an alleged group called the Croth. During later testimony, Woodham claimed he had become involved in Satanism and described believing he could summon or direct dark forces statements that prosecutors treated as self-serving and alarming. The defense pointed to those claims and to psychological testimony as signs of severe instability, while prosecutors argued the facts showed planning and intent. On the morning of October 1, 1997, Woodham killed his mother, Mary Ann Woodham, at their home. Afterward, he wrote a statement and gave writings to a friend at school, then drove himself to Pearl High wearing a long coat to conceal a rifle. In the commons area where students gathered before classes, he opened fire. Christina Menifee, 16 years old, and Lydia K. Dew, 17 years old, were killed, and 7 other students were wounded. Witnesses later said his expression seemed blank and distant, and some recalled him speaking afterward in a subdued way, apologizing or saying he had not singled out specific people. The rampage ended outside when Assistant Principal Joel Myrick confronted him. Myrick retrieved a handgun from his vehicle and ordered Woodham to the ground, holding him there until police arrived. Reporting from the time captured a surreal detail. Woodham recognized Myrick from a recent pizza delivery discount, as if reaching for ordinary conversation, while everything around them had collapsed. In the days that followed, investigators interviewed students, collected writings, and traced the network of rumors that quickly formed around the case, including talk of conspirators and cult influence. Woodham was tried as an adult in separate proceedings for his mother's death and the school shooting. His defense argued that he was legally insane, supported by testimony from a defense psychologist, but juries rejected the insanity defense. He was sentenced to life in prison for his mother's murder. He was then convicted of the murders of Christina Menifee and Lydia K. Dew, along with multiple counts tied to the students who were wounded, receiving additional life sentences and lengthy consecutive terms. The Mississippi Supreme Court later affirmed his convictions on appeal, and reporting at the time noted that he would not be eligible for parole until he reached his mid-60s. As of mid-January 2026, the Mississippi Department of Corrections lists Luke Woodham as incarcerated in state custody and serving life sentences. Number 2. John Robert Williams was a long-haul truck driver from Mississippi born in 1976. When he was arrested in Pearl, Mississippi in August of 2004, he was 28 years old. His job meant long stretches of solitude, endless miles, and a routine built around truck stops and highway exits. News coverage at the time offered few details about his childhood or home life, focusing instead on the widening criminal investigation that would surround his name. That mobile lifestyle became central to investigators' concerns. Officials described a disturbing overlap between multiple cases women last seen near truck stops, later found in remote areas close to major roadways. Even as comparisons multiplied across state lines, authorities cautioned that similarities do not automatically prove one offender committed every crime. Still, the possibility of a traveling pattern created urgency because each new report raised the same question: who could move so easily and remain so hard to pin down? The case that firmly anchored to Williams was the death of Nikki Hill, a 28-year-old woman from Mississippi. Investigators said Williams and his girlfriend, Rachel Cumberland, met Hill at a casino. In the summer of 2004, Hill went missing. On July 18th, she was found near a road outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. The publicly released details were limited, but the impact was immediate, a family searching for answers and a community struggling to understand how a night out could end in disappearance. Williams was taken into custody weeks later, and officials soon said they were also pursuing charges tied to the death of Jennifer Hyman, a 24-year-old from Oklahoma City who was last seen at a truck stop. Hyman was later found near a bridge in Lafayette County, Mississippi in late summer of 2003. Around the same time, Mississippi's Public Safety Commissioner said authorities were examining whether Williams and Cumberland could be linked to several other deaths in multiple states, all sharing connections to truck stop corridors and highway routes. Behind-the-scenes detectives from different jurisdictions compared evidence interviews and travel patterns. A Texas sergeant working one related investigation told reporters his department believed Williams had extensive knowledge about the cases they were examining. For families, that kind of statement can be agonizing, hinting at answers that might exist, but remain out of reach. In July of 2005, Williams pleaded guilty in Mississippi to the kidnapping and murder of Nikki Hill. He was sentenced to life in prison with an additional term tied to the kidnapping conviction. Cumberland pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a prison sentence, even after the plea investigators continued to question Williams as part of a multi-state task force. But Mississippi officials also said no other cases had been officially connected to him and Cumberland at that time, even as the broader investigation continued. Years later, prosecutors in Texas announced another step. A grand jury indicted Williams in the death of Vicki Helen Anderson, a woman last seen at a truck stop in Sayre and later found along Interstate 40. John Robert Williams remains incarcerated in Mississippi, serving a life sentence at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. Number 3. Earl Wesley Berry was 28 years old when he was arrested, and the public record focused more on his criminal history and family dependents than on any occupation. By the late 1980s, he had no stable place in the community. Later affidavits described him as someone who relied heavily on family and struggled to live independently. Mental health was central to later court arguments, with reports citing slow development childhood head injuries, repeated suicide attempts, and expert testimony that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. On Sunday, November 29, 1987, Mary Bounds, a 56-year-old woman in Houston, Mississippi, disappeared after being seen near the First Baptist Church she attended. She was reported missing around midnight. Investigators located her car near the church and noted signs of a struggle. As the search widened, items connected to her were found along nearby roads, and her body was discovered the next day in nearby woods. The most detailed account of what happened came from Berry's own statements, later summarized in court. After leaving a friend's apartment, he drove through Houston at about 7 o'clock that evening and saw Bounds near the church. He approached her, and when she reacted, he forced her into his vehicle and left town. Berry later said he intended a sexual assault, but it did not occur. Instead, he drove to isolated locations, and Bounds died from head injuries consistent with a severe beating. Afterward, Berry drove to his grandmother's house. Investigators later described evidence that he tried to erase traces of the crime, including burning clothing and attempting to clean the vehicle he had been using. When officers began questioning him, Berry denied involvement and offered a story to explain the burned clothes. But investigators kept pressing, searching the car, checking the timeline, and comparing his account to what they were finding. On Sunday, December 6, 1987, law enforcement arrived at Berry's home, advised him of his rights, and questioned him about the prior weekend. He was taken to jail in Houston. Later that day, officers returned to speak with him again. Berry indicated he wanted to call a lawyer, then chose not to place the call when given the chance. After being advised of his rights again, he confessed, and that confession became a cornerstone of the prosecution. A Chickasaw County grand jury indicted Berry in early March of 1988 for the kidnapping and murder of Mary Bounds. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty, and Berry rejected an offer of life in prison in exchange for a guilty plea. After trial, a jury convicted him and imposed a death sentence. The Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the conviction, but overturned the initial death sentence and ordered a new sentencing trial. Because of heavy publicity, the resentencing was moved to Union County, and in late June of 1992, a jury again returned a death sentence. In the years that followed, Berry's attorneys argued he met the legal definition of intellectual disability and should not be executed at a time when lethal injection protocols were under national scrutiny. Bound's family, including her daughter, spoke publicly about how each new court date reopened old grief. Courts rejected the final appeals, and Earl Wesley Berry was executed by lethal injection at the Mississippi State Penitentiary on May 21, 2008. Number 4. Deryl Paul Dedmon Jr. was 18 years old when his name became tied to one of Mississippi's most widely watched hate crime cases. A white teenager from Brandon, a suburb outside Jackson, he had recently finished high school and blended easily into the public image of small-town youth friends, parties, and late nights. But people who knew him described a darker edge beneath that surface, including earlier episodes of intimidation and bullying behavior that hinted at anger and a need for control. In the spring of 2011, investigators later said Dedmon and a circle of friends began making trips into Jackson with a shared purpose to harass and attack black residents they viewed as easy targets. Federal authorities said the group specifically looked for people they believed were homeless, or under the influence, assuming those victims would be less likely to resist or report what happened. The pattern wasn't spontaneous, it was repetitive, discussed openly, and followed by boasting afterward. On the night leading into June 26, 2011, that mindset escalated. After a birthday party in Puckett, Mississippi, the group talked about going into Jackson to find black people to harass. In the early morning hours, they drove into West Jackson in multiple vehicles circling the area while looking for someone to single out. According to federal court admissions summarized by the Department of Justice, the plan was deliberate: find a person, isolate them, and act together. They eventually spotted James Craig Anderson, a black man who was alone in a motel parking lot off Ellis Avenue. Anderson was 47 years old and worked at an auto plant. Prosecutors described him as an ordinary man returning to his car before dawn. The group decided he fit the kind of target they had been seeking. Several of them approached, distracting and assaulting him, while waiting for others, Dedmon included, to arrive. Witness accounts and court filings described racist language and white supremacist slogans being used to fuel the moment and impress each other. What happened next unfolded quickly, but the emotional weight lingered for a community already sensitive to racial violence. Authorities said Dedmon drove a pickup truck through the parking lot and struck Anderson as the group fled. Afterward, investigators said Dedmon bragged about what he had done using a racial slur. A major turning point in the investigation was surveillance video from the motel area, which helped law enforcement identify vehicles' movements and the sequence of events. Local police moved swiftly, and the FBI joined to determine whether federal civil rights charges applied, because proving motive matters in hate crime cases. The FBI later described an intensive investigation involving interviews, search warrants, and analysis of phone records that ultimately uncovered a broader conspiracy involving 10 individuals. Dedmon was arrested in early July 2011 and eventually faced both state and federal consequences. In March 21, 2012, he pleaded guilty in Mississippi State Court and received 2 concurrent life sentences enhanced under the state's hate crime statute. The following day, he and 2 others pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy and to violating the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in what the Department of Justice described as a historic use of that law in a death-resulting case. In federal court, Dedmon was later sentenced to 600 months, the equivalent of 50 years for the hate crime charges. He remains incarcerated, serving 2 concurrent life terms in Mississippi, alongside the federal sentence. Number 5. Curtis Giovanni Flowers was 26 years old when 4 employees at Tardy Furniture in Winona, Mississippi were killed on a summer morning in July of 1996. Flowers was a black man from a small town where people knew each other's families and where reputations, good or bad, traveled fast. In the weeks before the crime, he had worked at the store and then left after a dispute about damaged merchandise that he was told would be deducted from his pay. Not long after, he relocated to Plano, Texas, trying to start over with a new job and some distance from the tension back home. The victims were store owner Bertha Tardy, bookkeeper Carmen Rigby, delivery worker Robert Golden, and part-time employee Derek Stewart, a teenager who was brought to the hospital and later died from his injuries. A retired employee, Sam Jones Jr., arrived after being asked to come in, and what he found inside the store became the beginning of a long chain of grief suspicion and courtroom battles. Investigators documented shell casings and bullets tied to a .380 caliber pistol, and they noticed faint shoe prints at the scene details that would loom large because there was little else that clearly pointed to a single person. Early on, police focused on Flowers. They tested his hands for gunshot residue and reported finding a particle, but they released him after he denied involvement. His fingerprints did not match prints recovered at the store, and later testing did not uncover DNA evidence tying him to the crime scene. Investigators also explored a possible connection to a pistol reported stolen from Flowers' uncle on the day of the murders, and firearms testimony became a major point of dispute. Over time, another example of how the case would repeatedly hinge on interpretation rather than a single decisive piece of proof. As the investigation continued, the narrative hardened into a theory of motive, robbery, resentment, and opportunity. But the physical scene complicated that story. Reports noted that the cash drawer contained change but no bills, and the safe appeared undisturbed, details that raised questions about whether robbery truly explained what happened or whether the scene reflected something else entirely. Over the next 2 decades, Flowers would be tried 6 times, an extraordinary legal saga driven by the same lead prosecutor, Doug Evans. The state's case relied heavily on witness accounts and alleged jailhouse confessions. Later investigative reporting and court records documented recantations and claims of pressure people who once said they saw Flowers near the store or heard him confess later said their statements were wrong or induced. Each reversal and retrial reopened the wounds for the victims' families, while Flowers remained trapped in a loop where he could win an appeal, yet still not regain freedom. In June of 2010, a jury convicted Flowers again and sentenced him to death. That conviction became the center of a national spotlight on jury selection. In June of 2019, the United States Supreme Court reversed the conviction ruling that the trial court had clearly erred in accepting the state's reasons for striking a black prospective juror and emphasizing a broader history of discriminatory jury strikes across Flowers' prior trials. The decision was 7-2. Flowers was released on bail in December of 2019, while the state weighed a possible 7th trial. Then, on September 4, 2020, Mississippi's Attorney General dropped the charges ending the prosecution. The case remains officially unsolved, and Curtis Flowers is a free man after the dismissal. Number 6. Leslie Bo Galloway III was a young man from Moss Point, Mississippi. He was about 25 years old when Shaquilla Anderson disappeared, and about 27 years old when a Harrison County jury later convicted him. By that point, he was not living a stable, ordinary life. Court records show he was under Mississippi Department of Corrections supervision and had a prior conviction, including a carjacking that prosecutors pointed to as part of his criminal history. His public image as presented in court was shaped less by a steady job or community role and more by an escalating pattern of trouble with the law. In later appeals, his attorneys argued that the jury never heard much about his personal history beyond the basics. Advocacy filings describe what they say was a childhood marked by severe abuse and long-term trauma, including symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. Those claims became central to arguments about sentencing, Not because they excused what happened, but because in capital cases jurors weigh background and mental health when deciding between life and death. On Friday night, December 5th, 2008, Shakelia Anderson, a high school senior from Gulfport, was at her grandmother's home with family. According to testimony summarized in court records, a call came in that showed the name Bo. Later that night, Anderson walked outside and got into a white Ford Taurus in the driveway. After that, she did not come home. The next day, her body was found in a secluded wooded area in northern Harrison County, near a dirt logging road off Highway 15. Investigators secured the scene and began piecing together what had happened. Prosecutors would later allege that Anderson had been sexually assaulted and that a vehicle was used during the attack. They also said steps were taken afterward to destroy evidence by fire and to abandon her body in a remote location. The details described in court were a major reason the case drew intense attention across the Gulf Coast, especially among students and parents who saw Anderson as a familiar face in their community. The investigation moved quickly once witnesses shared what they knew about the last time Anderson was seen. Family members described the car and the person she left with, and investigators focused on Galloway. Court records describe officers locating a white Ford Taurus consistent with the witness description, and investigators collecting evidence connected to the vehicle. In earlier news coverage, prosecutors said Anderson's remains were found under the car, and Galloway admitted to police that he picked her up that night, an acknowledgement that placed him at the center of the timeline, even as he faced mounting forensic evidence. In 2010, a jury convicted Galloway of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. His conviction and sentence were upheld on direct appeal by the Mississippi Supreme Court, and subsequent efforts for relief continued for years through state and federal courts. In later filings, Galloway's attorneys raised issues that included the use of forensic testimony claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and concerns about jury selection arguments that the courts ultimately rejected at multiple stages. In the fall of 2024, the United States Supreme Court declined to take up an appeal, while separate federal litigation remained pending. Galloway remains on Mississippi's death row under a sentence of death by lethal injection. Number 7. Joseph Bishop Goff was 28 years old when he became the center of a homicide case in George County, Mississippi. He was from Alabama, and relatives later said he had been a troubled kid who spent time in jail. His occupation was not consistently described in public records, but his family said he talked about turning his life around. His mother remembered him carrying a Bible and saying he was on a mission. In late summer of 2004, he was traveling with Brandy Stewart Yates, a 29-year-old wife and mother from Alabama, who worked as a cocktail waitress. Court records say Brandy met Goff while working at a bar in Theodore, Alabama, and soon left her family to travel with him. On the afternoon of August 26th, she checked into room 121 at the Rocky Creek Inn in Loosedale, Mississippi with Goff. Later that day, an altercation took place, and he left the motel. That evening, Brandy called her husband several times. She said Goff had slapped her earlier, and she told him she was afraid he would come back and hurt her. One call ended abruptly when someone knocked on her door. In the last conversation, she and her husband planned for him to pick her up early the next morning. Near midnight, a motel clerk saw Goff return to the front desk again and again, saying he and his girlfriend were locked out and asking for new keys. After multiple attempts, the clerk told him the door was locked from the inside. After that, Brandy could not be reached. When her husband called the front desk for help, he was told the phone in the room was off the hook. On the morning of August 27th, the motel owner noticed what looked like fire damage in room 121. She entered, saw Brandy's body on the floor, and immediately called 911. Detectives secured the scene and used the motel registration materials, including a copy of Brandy's driver's license to identify her and to learn she had arrived in a white Ford Mustang. Later that afternoon, a Mississippi Highway Patrol trooper spotted a white Ford Mustang on Interstate 20 near Vicksburg. The temporary tag appeared defaced and expired, giving the trooper a reason to stop the car. Investigators testified that Brandy's wallet and other items tied to the motel room were found with Goff. He was taken into custody that same day, and statements described in court say he admitted taking items from the room and deliberately setting the room on fire. Prosecutors charged him with capital murder, arguing the killing occurred during a robbery, and also charged him with second-degree arson. In an unusual turn, Goff asked to represent himself at trial. The judge allowed it after questioning him and keeping attorneys available to assist. A George County jury convicted him, and on May 6, 2005, he was sentenced to death. He also received a 10-year sentence for the arson conviction. On direct appeal, the Mississippi Supreme Court affirmed the conviction and the death sentence. During sentencing, the defense presented evidence of a turbulent childhood and serious mental illness, arguing he had been in a psychotic episode at the time of the crime. In later years, his post-conviction proceedings were repeatedly affected by questions of competency and mental health treatment. Joseph Bishop Goff remained in Mississippi custody and died at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in July of 2019. Number 8. Edgar Ray Killen. Often known around Neshoba County as Preacher, lived two public lives at once. He was a part-time Baptist minister and a sawmill worker in the Philadelphia, Mississippi area, presenting himself as a familiar small-town churchman. At the same time, investigators later described him as a Ku Klux Klan organizer and recruiter. He was about 39 years old when 3 civil rights workers vanished in the summer of 1964, and he was 79 years old when Mississippi finally arrested him more than 4 decades later. In that era, Mississippi was a pressure cooker. The civil rights movement was pushing into places where voter intimidation and segregation were enforced not only by custom but by organized violence. Freedom Summer brought volunteers from outside the state to help Black Mississippians register to vote and to support local organizing. For white supremacist groups, that work was treated as an invasion. Killen's role, according to later testimony and court findings, was not impulsive street-level rage, but planning and mobilization, turning ideology into coordinated action. On June 21, 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were in Neshoba County, investigating the burning of a Black church and meeting with local residents. Chaney was a young Black Mississippian. Goodman and Schwerner were young Jewish New Yorkers volunteering with the Congress of Racial Equality. Late that afternoon, Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price stopped their car and arrested them on a traffic-related charge, holding them in jail for hours. After nightfall, Price released them and then followed them out of town. What happened next became one of the most infamous civil rights-era crimes in American history. Federal and state accounts describe a coordinated ambush involving Klansmen and assistance from law enforcement. Prosecutors later argued that Killen helped assemble the group, encouraged participants to be ready, and acted as a central organizer. The men disappeared into the rural roads outside Philadelphia, and for weeks their families and co-workers were left with nothing but silence and dread. The disappearance triggered an enormous federal investigation that the FBI later summarized under the name Mississippi Burning. Agents flooded the region, searched back roads and waterways, and leaned on informants to break through a wall of fear. The national media attention was intense, in part because 2 of the missing men were white Northerners, an uncomfortable reality that many observers said revealed how frequently violence against Black Mississippians had been ignored. When the bodies were eventually found, the case became a symbol of both the brutality of the period and the power of public pressure. In the 1960s, Mississippi did not bring murder charges. The federal government pursued civil rights conspiracy cases, instead leading to convictions for several men in 1967, including Deputy Price. Killen, however, escaped conviction. At that time, his case ended without a verdict after a lone juror reportedly said she could not convict a preacher. For decades, he lived as a free man, while the victims' families carried the unanswered weight of what had happened. That changed in January of 2005, when a Mississippi grand jury indicted Killen, and he was arrested. At our trial, prosecutors focused on his organizing role, how the crime depended on recruitment coordination, and a shared plan, not a single spontaneous act. On June 21, 2005, exactly 41 years after the disappearance, a jury found him guilty on 3 counts of manslaughter rather than murder. 2 days later, the judge imposed the maximum 60 years in prison, structured as 3 consecutive terms of 20 years. The Mississippi Supreme Court later upheld the conviction. Edgar Ray Killen remained incarcerated at the Mississippi State Penitentiary and died there in January of 2018 while serving his 60-year sentence. Number 9. Timothy Robert Ronk was 29 years old when police caught him, and he didn't have the kind of steady public career that anchors a person's identity. By the late summer of 2008, he was living in Biloxi, Mississippi, in the home of Michelle Crate, a woman in her late 30s. To neighbors and friends, their situation looked like an uneasy mix of dependence and closeness. He stayed under her roof, moved through her daily routine, and according to evidence later presented in court, had access to her money, her belongings, and her trust. Behind that living arrangement, a second relationship was taking shape in secret. Investigators and prosecutors would later describe Ronk spending increasing amounts of time communicating with a woman in Florida he met online. Phone records became part of the story, showing frequent contact as the days narrowed toward the crime. In testimony, that Florida woman told jurors she believed Ronk's relationship with Crate was only a roommate situation, while Ronk, in private, was describing a plan to leave Mississippi and start over with someone new. What followed on the morning of August 26, 2008, unfolded inside Crate's home. The case was prosecuted as a fatal domestic confrontation that escalated quickly. Ronk's later versions of events leaned on fear and self-defense, claiming Crate threatened him during an argument as he prepared to leave. Prosecutors, however, argued the scene showed intent and opportunism, especially when the timeline moved from the house to what Ronk did next. After the killing, authorities said Ronk set the house on fire in an attempt to conceal what had happened. They also said he took property from the home items that were later traced through pawn records and witness testimony. In court, filings and reporting investigators described him pawning electronics and other belongings linked to Crate, and using Crate's financial accounts during his flight. The emotional pressure in this story isn't just in the violence itself, but in the cold momentum afterward. A man leaves a burned home behind, then immediately turns to transactions, purchases movement, and messages like a switch has flipped. The same day, Ronk drove out of Mississippi toward Florida. The Florida woman testified that he arrived that evening and proposed marriage, presenting a ring that prosecutors said was purchased using Crate's money. In later descriptions of the evidence, receipts and bank records were used to build a minute-by-minute trail from Biloxi to Florida, one that in the state's telling showed not panic but follow-through. Ronk was arrested the next day in Florida after investigators traced his movements, including alleged use of Crate's cards. A Biloxi detective later testified that Ronk broke down during questioning and confessed. Beyond the interview room, there was also a paper trail testimony, and legal records describe Ronk writing a letter that included an admission of responsibility and a depiction of Crate as someone he could use. Language prosecutors treated as revealing motive control, extraction, and escape. In October of 2010, a Harrison County jury convicted Ronk of capital murder and armed robbery. He was sentenced to death for the murder, along with an additional 30-year prison sentence for armed robbery. His appeals and post-conviction challenges continued for years. The Mississippi Supreme Court declined to revisit his case again in early 2024, and later reporting confirmed the United States Supreme Court declined to take his appeal as well. Timothy Robert Ronk remains on death row at the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. Number 10. Carla Ann Hughes was a middle school teacher in Jackson, Mississippi, and she was 25 years old when police began investigating her in a case that horrified the community. In public, Hughes appeared composed and professional, someone trusted with students and a predictable routine. Family members later described a more complicated background, adopted as an infant, teased while growing up, and deeply rooted in church. She was also a mother, and people close to her said she often tried to keep peace and avoid open conflict. In August of 2006, Hughes met Keon Pittman at Chastain Middle School, where both worked. Their friendship became an affair, even though Pittman lived in Ridgeland with his fiancée, Avis Banks. Banks was 27 years old and pregnant with Pittman's child. Pittman testified that Banks did not know about the relationship and that Hughes stayed involved while he still planned to marry Banks. He said Hughes sometimes spoke as if a future together was inevitable, calling him her future husband, while he told her repeatedly he was not leaving Banks. After a tense weekend meeting in Picayune, Pittman testified that Hughes warned him that things were going to change, and the relationship grew colder in the days that followed. On Wednesday, November 29, 2006. Banks returned to the Ridgeland home she shared with Pittman after work. Investigators later concluded she was attacked in the garage soon after arriving. Banks died, and the pregnancy did not survive. Police noted signs of forced entry at a rear door, as if someone wanted the scene to resemble a break-in, but they reported no property missing. Pittman found Banks and called for help. For Banks's family, the loss was immediate and overwhelming, made heavier by the fact that she had been preparing for a child. Detectives first examined Pittman closely, but court records later said the investigation established he was at the school during the critical window. The focus shifted to Hughes, who knew where Banks lived and had visited the home before. Prosecutors pointed to cell phone records that placed Hughes in the vicinity of the Ridgeland home around the time Banks was killed. Investigators also followed a trail of borrowed weapons and physical evidence. A witness testified that he had loaned Hughes a knife and a Rossi .38 caliber revolver a few days earlier, and that she returned the gun afterward with no rounds left inside. Police testimony described shoes found in Hughes's home that matched an impression left on the forced door, and forensic testing linked those shoes to Banks. Hughes was arrested on December 6, 2006, and local reporting said she resigned from her teaching job the next day. In the fall of 2009, a Madison County jury heard testimony about the relationship, the timeline, and the forensic trail. Hughes did not testify. On October 13, 2009, the jury found her guilty of 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Avis Banks and Banks's unborn child. The jury declined to impose a death sentence, and on October 14, 2009, she was sentenced to 2 terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Carla Ann Hughes remains in Mississippi Department of Corrections custody, serving 2 life sentences without parole.